Okay. Let me share the other presentation. Let's do this. This is this one. Feel free to yell at me. Anyways, thanks for having me out. The topic that I'll be speaking about tonight is, you can see it on the screen here, changes in Illinois' avifauna, the bird life of the state. And I'm going to be speaking from the perspective of someone who's on the state records committee. I'll talk a little bit about the records committee and what it does. But by and large, it's a look at how it is that the status and distribution of the bird life in the state is evolving over time. And we live in very interesting times. There's a lot of stuff that's going on right now that has me a little bit perplexed, I guess. In some cases, other things make sense, whatnot, but it seems like things, at least in certain quarters, are changing pretty quickly. And what I mean by this records committee perspective is, I'm not really looking at, how many and what distribution the chickadees and the robins and the cardinals have or what have you, but talking about things that are somewhat on the fringe. So the records committee looks at the rarities that occur in the state. And so there have been a lot of changes in what's rare. And predominantly what I'll be talking about are things that used to be rare, that aren't rare anymore, and how quickly they've gone from never having occurred in the state to being a regular part of the bird life around us. So that's the plan. I mentioned these two words, status and distribution. By status, I mean, is the bird regularly? Is it common? Is it uncommon? Is it somewhat unusual? Is it very unusual? Is it extremely unusual? And then by distribution, two ways that we can have the distribution of the bird life in us is, one is spatially. For instance, we get black-capped chickadees in the northern part of Illinois, but down in the southern part of Illinois, it's Carolina chickadees. So the distribution of black-capped chickadees is in the northern half of the state, roughly speaking, Carolina in the southern half of the state. And then we have distribution over time. And you can just think of that as the annual cycles that we have. So we have birds that are here year round. We have birds that come up from the south and spend the summer with us, and then they head back out. We have birds that come down to enjoy our balmy winters from up north. They come down here. And then we have strictly passage migrants, going through, and the timing of all this is depends on the species. So that's kind of what I mean by the status and distribution. It's kind of the lay of the land with respect to what kinds of birds that we have, how common are they, where are they, and when do we see them. Now, there's a lot of information that's out there about the status and distribution, and a lot of it is in our heads if we spend time with the birds and we're familiar with things. But back in the 20th century and prior, they had these things called books. I guess we're in a library, so probably and then we have periodicals or journals. And then, now in the 21st century, we have databases and the information age and the internet and all that kind of stuff. And what I'm pointing out here we'll take a look at some of the stuff that's in the book, but in these books, but most of the books that purport to give us a sense of what the status and distribution of the Illinois bird life is, we'll see some examples of these bar charts. That the thickness of the bar tells us how common it is. The presence of the bar tells us it's across. Well, I mean, I'll show, and I'll go back to that and talk about it when we have one in front of us. But back before we had lots and lots of data, you go back 125 years ago, one of the first compendia of all this information was Robert Ridgway's tome, The Ornithology of Illinois. There are a couple other ones that are maybe a little bit more regional along the way. And then Dave Bolin, down at the Illinois State Museum, back in, I guess this is now 35 years ago or thereabouts, he authored The Birds of Illinois. 10 years prior to that, Dave had an annotated checklist of the birds of Illinois. That was the basis for doing this volume. And then also because it was now 100 years since Ridgway's work, that it was something of a, a century overdue update of what Robert Ridgway had put together. And although I know various individuals that have said at different times in the past 20 or 30 years that they were working on an update of Dave Boland's The Birds of Illinois, it hasn't come out yet. Maybe it'll appear. And so this is a very good source of what the occurrence of birds in the state were. But now, of course, it's 35 years old. The next update of sorts, at least, was Cheryl DeVore's Birding Illinois. And Cheryl's book in the back, she's got these bar charts that kind of show the lay of the land with respect to, what the bird, where to find, a relatively shorthand regional distribution, but certainly that temporal distribution across the year from January to February. And these are all good sources of information for what the lay of the land looked like historically. These journals that I mentioned, the Meadowlark, published by the Illinois Ornithological Society, and North American Birds, published by the American Birding Association, have seasonal reports that kind of describe what's going on in the seasons. And so it's kind of, noting changes and things that are happening. Meadowlark is changing their format right now. So I think some of it is not actually in the journal form, and it's now up on the web at least. And then, North American Birds has been going for a long, long time. I think it started out as Bird Lore back around like 1900. And then it took on the name Audubon Field Notes. At one point it was called American Birds. And relatively recently it moved from the Audubon Society, National Audubon Society, over to the American Birding Association. But anyways, people are interested in the status and distribution, and then individuals like yourselves are going out and making observations. The observations kind of go out into the network. These days, we're mentioning checking eBird sightings on your trip up to the Yawkey Art Museum. So it's there's all this information that's out there. And so we're going to be looking at that information to some extent as we go along. Here is an example of what I mean by one of these bar charts. This is from the back of Cheryl's book, Birding Illinois book. And so these are the various bird species listed down here. These all happen to be ducks. She gives a little bit of a regional summary if there's differences in distribution between the northern part of the state and the southern part of the state. And then we can see going from January, February, March, all the way across to December, the presence of the birds. So the mallard duck is here year round, but during the spring migratory period and the fall migratory period, it's a little more common than the rest of the time of the year. Something like a Eurasian widgeon is a relatively rare thing, apparently with a prevalence more in the spring to show up. The gadwall is here in the migratory periods, a little bit less so in the middle of winter, but tends to be absent in the warm months, et cetera, et cetera. Right. So this is kind of a picture for each of these individual species as to when they're here, how many of them are here. That's the thickness of the bars. So say like for the American widgeon, a common fall migrant, but very thinly distributed in the summer with some non-breeding birds hanging out, and we get this kind of picture. Today we can go, if we have an internet connection that's on our smartphones or whatever, we can access all this business that sits out in eBird, this project of the Cornell Lab of Ornithology. And I know early on they partnered with the Audubon Society, and we, the United States taxpayer, have provided a lot of support for their operation. But they've got a really powerful thing going. And so rather than waiting for 20 years for the next publication of the book and the updating of the bar charts, we can kind of go look at this live. Now, the specific and precise meaning that was put into the bar charts changes. It depends on who's putting it together. The way that eBird works it is they look at the fraction of checklists. Sorry, let me get this right. eBird will make the bar fatter as the fraction of complete checklists that reports that species increases. So the eBird bar chart is really how common is it for this to occur, but not necessarily how many numbers of individuals there are. Whereas the Cheryl DeVore's chart is a little bit more intended to be numbers of individuals. But nonetheless, we can get that same kind of information. And you can see that, this looks roughly the same. Wood ducks are common throughout the summer periods, maybe slightly more common in the migration periods, and slightly less common in the middle of winter, and so forth and so on. Now, when I moved to the Chicago area, or moved to Chicago actually in 1989 from the East. I was in New York State at the time. I grew up in New Jersey, spent some time in Alabama, whatever. I came to, I became a bird watcher during some portion there, and then I reload to Chicago, and I need to get oriented to what's going on with birds in Chicago. And Steve Mladenov had this book, Chicago Area Birds, that was recommended to me. Same sort of thing. So I bought Steve's book, and it was published in 1984, just 5 years prior to my arrival, and it was already starting to get out of date. I mean, part of that was like, development and the sprawl kind of going out, and these good spots to go find Henslow sparrows were now shopping malls and this kind of thing. But for each species, Mladenov has the same kind of bar chart set up. And one of the interesting things was that the great egret bar chart in Mladenov's book said that this dashed line means that they're rare and they don't occur. And then the little thin line meant that they were rather uncommon. And so basically he's saying in this bar chart that great egrets are uncommon species in that post-breeding dispersal period when a lot of the herons start moving around, and rare the rest of the time, and not here at all outside the spring and the early part of fall. But if you look today at the distribution of great egrets, and what I did here to say was, okay, this is the Chicago area. Let me use eBird to give this bar chart for just Cook County, and just for the year. I'm sorry, no, I didn't do it for the year, but I think I did like a 10-year period or something, but recent, not going back into the dawn of time. And what we see is that, great egrets are common in our area, basically from April all the way through to October. And it's not terribly unusual to see them into December. Although they vacate, when we've got all the snow and ice and what have you, and then they start coming back around the beginning of March. And so you look at this picture between what Steve Mladenov understood to be the case in 1984 and what's now the case in 2023, and it's different. The status and distribution of great egret has changed. Now, what's next here? Oh, yeah. So like I said in the title, that we're going to look at changes in the status and distribution of Illinois bird life, but we're going to do it from the Records Committee perspective, and not look so much at the common birds, but look at the rare birds. And the organization that we have some kind of an adjudication role in all of this is the Illinois Ornithological Records Committee, or IORC, which is a committee of the Illinois Ornithological Society. It started out, it was part of the Illinois Audubon Society back in 1985 when it was founded. And around that time, there was this whole movement to get records committees like this established in all 50 of the US states and all, the dozen plus Canadian provinces. And this is something that was following the model of the British Rarities Committee, which was to, for these unusual events, because the unusual events require a higher standard of evidence, to have a body that would gather the evidence, make a judgment on the evidence, and most importantly, archive the evidence for future generations to look at. And so So the records committee, a lot of the work of the records committee is someone says, I just saw an ostrich, running past the Cook Library in Libertyville. It was really big, 10 feet tall, whatever. And so, you get photographs or audio recordings or write a description. You send all that material into the records committee, and the records committee says, thank you very much. And then they decide, yeah, it looks like this really was an ostrich. And then we put all the material into the archives. So that's this piece, the evaluating the evidence of the occurrence of rare and unusual birds. We also keep the official list of birds for the state. And so if there's something, the big events are where we have a species that's never before occurred in the state. And if the committee deems that the evidence is good to substantiate the fact that it did now occur in the state, we add it to the list and so forth. So this has been going on for, 45 years now, or 40 years, I guess that is. I'm getting ahead of myself. Here's some of the early members of IORC. This is Dick Palmer and Ron Getz, one of the early secretaries. We call the person who runs the show and these things. This is Vern Kleen, who's done an awful lot to help us understand what's going on with Illinois bird life. Rich Biss used to run the Chicago Audubon Society hotline for many, many, many years. Sue Stroyles. Here's Dave Bolin, the fellow that wrote the book of the Birds of Illinois. And this is Joe Milosevic. Different period back in 1985. Back in 1985, it was basically Joe Milosevic and Dennis Emke and a couple of other people, just a handful, no more than 5 really, of regular photographers of the bird life in the birding community. These days we've got phone cameras on our phones, digital cameras of all types, and it's much more common to get imagery, but back in that day it was kind of expensive. And here's a more recent view of IORC at one of our meetings in the Field Museum. We're looking at trays of specimens while we were adjudicating the small-billed Alania record, or one of them. So that's what the records committee does. And I've been either fortunate or cursed to be on the thing for going on. We're somewhere between 10 and 15 years now. But it's over this course of time that I've gotten familiar with a lot of what's happening, and I've been the secretary now for 8 years, and so every year we have a meeting, and what we do is determine whether or not the status of birds have changed. We update the indication of the bird's status on the official list. There's something that we call the review list that I'll talk about before. The review list is basically the list of rare stuff that we want this documentation for. And I've watched a lot of the changes that I'm going to talk to you about tonight. And then over the last couple of years, some things, even more dramatic in terms of the pace of change, as I said before. So what I want to do is get you familiar with at least some of the terminology that we use, because essentially what I'm going to be talking to you about is when bird species go from rare in the state, which will either be casual or accidental, to regular in the state. And by and large, it's the text that's in the green and the red that is the important part here, is that if we have, if a some species of bird shows up somewhere in the state in at least 8 out of every 10 years, then we think of it as occurring regularly. Now, it might be that every 10 years we only get 8 individuals showing up in the state, which is not, a lot, but, there's a regular pattern, just a regular pattern of occurrence. Or it could be, we get hundreds each year in the state, or thousands or millions or what have you. When we get down to the rare stuff, we use the term casual to indicate something that typically shows up only from 3 to 7 years out of a 10-year period. So it's showing up, but not regularly enough to be deemed to have this regular status code attached to it. And then there's accidental, which is 1 or 2 years or no years out of each 10-year period they show up. And what we do is we keep what we call the review list, which is the list of species or kinds of birds that we want this evidence for. And basically anything that is casual or accidental by the bylaws under which we operate has to be on the review list. Some things that occur regularly, we also keep on the review list because they're pretty thin and maybe there's some identification problems. And so we want to, be sure of the quality of the information that we're gathering on those things. But basically what we're looking at is the rare stuff that I'm going to talk about are things that well, 3 levels. One, where there's 3 levels for the occurrence of the birds. One is that they've never occurred in Illinois. That's the rarest. They haven't ever occurred. All right. Secondly, they have occurred, but very, very, very thinly. They're either casual or accidental, so, half years or fewer is their occurrence. And then things that occur more regularly than that. Okay. And so what I'm going to do is talk about birds that have gone either from regular or from rare to regular, or have gone from haven't ever occurred and have gone to regular, basically. And so it's when we find that, gee, this kind of species that we used to think of as being really rare is now happening. It's now coming to Illinois frequently enough that we no longer have to keep it on the review list. And I've grouped, we're going to talk about a whole bunch of different kinds of birds, and they're going to be in 3 groups. One that I labeled the invaders from the south. Okay. There's a bunch of those, and that's where a lot of really dramatic stuff is going on. And then we have some stragglers that come to us from the west. And then we have some species that are going to come from overworld. All right. And so we'll get into the first group in a moment. Yeah, it sounds like some people know what this is. Like, this is kudzu taking over. Any questions at this point? Yeah.
So we have some birds that are like regular visitors during migration, but not in the middle of summer. And like, so birds that have started spending longer, they're not rare because they're usually coming through in migration, but it's unusual now to see birds nesting.
Yeah. Okay. So there's a whole host. So the question is, what about birds that are, say, maybe we're passing through Illinois and not staying to breed, but now more staying to breed. They may not be rare in migration, but now we're having rare events of breeding occurrence, for instance. Or, I mean, I'm not going to talk about that, but a lot of that kind of stuff is going on. It happens in a variety of different forms. There's kind of, along the lines of the invaders from the south, there are a whole number of species that somewhere in Illinois or somewhere close to Illinois is the or used to be the northern limit of their range, and that northern limit of their range is going further north. Up here, it's much more common to see yellow-throated warblers, blue grosbeak, Bell's vireo, lark sparrow, things like this that were more southerly breeders than northern Illinois, but now they're becoming more common in northern Illinois. There's a lot of that stuff that's going on. Maybe that's a talk for another day. Yeah. Okay, so let's get into some of these bird species. This is the one that I think first caught my attention. The black-bellied whistling duck. This was the first individual that I saw in my home county of Cook County, in Lincoln Park. But black-bellied whistling duck, here's the normal range of this bird. It's basically a bird of the American tropics. And you can see that on this map, it comes up in South Texas, a lot of birds in South Texas, and then kind of thinly along a little bit off to the east along the Gulf Coast. There's some that kind of get up into Arizona, But here we are in Illinois, and we're way, 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 way far away from this map's depiction of the normal range of occurrence of black-bellied whistling duck. And another thing too here that you know, in this map, the purple color indicates year-round occurrence. The red color means the summer months occurrence. So basically, this is a non-migratory bird, just kind of stays in these warm, hot areas in the tropics, and then to some degree moves a little bit further north up the west coast of Mexico, right? But we're not anywhere in the range of black-bellied whistling duck, okay? Black-bellied whistling duck was not on the Illinois state list until the early part of the 21st century, where there was a hunter that shot one down in the southern part of the state. And so we got news of that and evidence of it, and now became added to the state list. Now, although that was the first occurrence, there were some, I think that, you know, historically, you know, and there were some site observations, maybe 2 or 3, something like that, over the course of the 19th and the 20th centuries, but not with enough evidence that we felt that we could say with certainty that they had occurred. So the first one that we knew for certain was in 2001, and the ones prior to that were, you know, you can count them on one hand if they were credible or not. And then things began to change. So basically in the year 2008 and onward, you know, through to today, there are black-bellied whistling ducks in the state of Illinois, right? Every year, every single year. And we would dutifully ask people to provide information about the sighting and look at it and evaluate it and whatnot, until finally we said, you know, these are occurring here regularly enough that we're now going to change the status to regular, take them off the review list, and just think of them as a normal part, a regularly occurring part of our state bird life. They also nested that same year for the first time in the state, at least that we know of. So we know that they have bred in the state, and I think it's just that one occurrence that we have documentation for, but they're probably breeding in a lot of different places. And if you look over this 20-year period from when they first occurred in the state until when we took them off the review list, more or less, or when we were reviewing records, we have 42 different records of black-bellied whistling duck over that 22-year period, which is like 2 a year, right? Okay, so it's not like, you know, hundreds of thousands of these ducks, but it, you know, they're occurring regularly enough, right? Here's the a shot. This is the shot that Penn Dahlbach do of the ducklings. I myself have never seen a baby black-bellied whistling duck, but they look pretty cool, huh? And now here, you know, another great thing about eBird is that you can kind of pull up a map of sightings over, you know, whatever time period that you want. And so this is just this current year. So from January to September, or I guess it's now October. Well, I did this in September, so it's just September. You know, so this is a map of sightings that have been reported into eBird of black-bellied whistling duck. And I don't know, you know, some of you may be familiar with these sightings maps, but let me orient to you here. This is Lake Michigan up there. Here's the northern boundary of Illinois, you know, Wisconsin to the north, Illinois to the south. This is the Mississippi River kind of coming down, our western border. Then we go up the Ohio River on the east, and then there's this north-south stretch that separates us from Indiana. So basically, here's Illinois. And then what eBird will do is put for you these little pins wherever there happens to be a sighting of the birds that's been reported in the database. There are 4 different kinds of pins here. There are small ones that look like this. There are these bigger ones like this red thing here. The big ones have a little flame in the side of it. It's a hot spot where where everybody can contribute to the sightings at that particular location. These are what are called personal locations that individuals set up. And then the red color means that it was within the last month, and the blue color means that it was longer ago than the month. You know, the red and the blue doesn't really much matter, but but this is 2023 black-bellied whistling ducks in Illinois. I can count 1, 2, 3 or 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, maybe. I don't know. Some of those are probably in Missouri. 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, 18, 19, 20. So 20 different sightings just in 2023. And the ones that we spent a lot of effort tracking down over the time frame from the year 2000 to the year 2020 was only twice that many. So in 1 year, we're getting about as half the numbers that we got over a 20-year period. This is a big change, and it's not something that we're particularly used to, that, you know, we get the bird showing up for the very first time, and, you know, normally it's like, okay, you wait another 15 years maybe, and there's another one, and another 20 years after that or something. But now these things they're now established. And interestingly, it was somewhere down here in Tennessee that there was a sewage treatment plant that was something of a staging area for these, where the population of black-bellied whistling ducks at that plant was something like 300 birds. So they came up from the Gulf Coast, you know, got in there and kind of kept going from there from forward. This is another waterfowl species from the south, the mottled duck. I mean, the status is changing with respect to this. It's a little bit more complicated story. The image here is so small. This comes from one of our records. This is a bird that Dan Kassenbaum photographed down at Carlisle Lake. It was the best photo that he could find in the Records Committee archives for mottled ducks, because I guess the ones that are up here are pretty shy. You know, maybe they're worried about hunters or something, and they don't get close, and we don't get good photographs, which is unfortunate, as we'll see in a moment. But the mottled duck, here's its range map. This is its worldwide distribution, same as with the black-bellied whistling duck. So basically, they're a bird of North America, but just a little thin section of them. They're kind of on the periphery of the Gulf of Mexico. There's a population in South Florida. There's also a population along the Texas coast. These the birds differ slightly. It's one subspecies over here, another subspecies over there. Permanent residents, they don't migrate. There's this kind of extended range. So they started, at least at the time that this map was created, there was some sense that they were dispersing up this way. And there was a breeding population there in Northeast Texas that would go up during the warm months and then retreat back to the Gulf Coast. And again, we're here, you know, way far away from the range. Okay. And mottled duck had not occurred in the state of Illinois until 2004. Okay. First state record was at Lake Springfield. Dave Bolin, who I mentioned before, who wrote the Birds of Illinois, he was the one that found the first state record. And now we have 12 accepted records. Maybe that's not a lot, but we also have another 10 records that, for whatever reason, did not pass muster the records committee. But there's this complication here, because the mottled duck, and you can see it here. I mean, you might say that this looks like a black duck, right? And sometimes black ducks and mallards can be mixed. So there's this thing called the mallard complex, which consists of the American black duck, the mottled duck, the mallard, and then there's another species, the Mexican duck, that has variously been treated as a subspecies of mallard or its own species. The American Ornithologists Union, or I guess it's it's AOS, American Ornithology Society now. But they've recently decided to elevate Mexican duck to the status of a full species. And one of the reasons why that the taxonomy is so unsettled is that these birds interbreed with each other in different places. So we can get mallard black duck hybrids, we can get mallard mottled duck hybrids, we can get mottled duck Mexican duck hybrids, mallard Mexican duck hybrids. And so in order to determine whether or not, you know, a particular sighting really is of a mottled duck, we have to worry about all these hybrids. And sometimes the observers, you know, on site aren't trying to do that. You know, they're just thinking they have a model duck, and and then these things stay far away. So there's probably some number of these rejected records that are good model ducks. And I also believe that there are some of the ones that we think of as we've accepted as good model ducks that are actually hybrids. So, you know, our knowledge is still kind of developing with respect to these species. But anyways, here's a chart, and I've indicated the number of records by year. In the ones that are accepted are in this dark blue, and the ones that we rejected are in this kind of paler blue. This is the very first one. And unlike with the black-bellied whistling duck, where there's like a report from like 1916 or something like this, and another one from 1942 that we couldn't find, you know, a description of the bird. It was just somebody said one of these things occurred, right? None of that for model duck. So this was the very first evidence of model duck coming into the state. And if you remember this definition for what on the rare stuff we consider to be regular status, is if it occurs, you know, in 8 out of the 10 years. And so if we sit here at 2023 and say, okay, let's look at the last 10 years, that goes back to this point, to this point here. We've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. We're just shy, okay? And then maybe if, you know, one more of those is good, we're at that threshold where we have 8 records over the last 10 years. Now, we don't know whether that's going to continue or not, but we're going from, you know, from, let's say, I don't know, somewhere around 100,000 BC all the way up to the year 2000, nothing. And then after 2004, you know, look, these things are starting to look like they're on their way to being annual. And my sense is that that's what's going to happen. We're going to see more and more of these, and these birds are figuring out how to colonize the eastern half of North America. All right, so here are three members of the mallard complex. This is a model duck here on the left. This is a mallard, and this one's a black duck. And so you can see how they're quite similar to each other. In fact, Leroy Harrison, he finds lots of good stuff down in the southern Illinois. He originally submitted this as 2 model ducks, you know, a pair of model ducks. It was not this was during, it wasn't quite the black ducks hadn't found their way back down there from the north at that point, and it seemed more likely that it was a model duck. But that's a black duck. Here's a little bit to kind of give you an idea of the problems with these hybrids. These are birds that look more or less like model ducks. One of the features is this kind of black gape mark that's typical of model ducks, and they're darker than female mallards, but just this little curl of the tail feathers. Male mallards have curled tail feathers. And so the fact that there's this little curl up here is an indication that there's probably some mallard genes in this individual. Another thing is that mallards have white tails, and the black duck and the model duck and the Mexican duck have dark tails, and there's just a little bit too much white in here. You know, the basic model duck tail should look more like this. And then you might say, well, then why isn't this a model duck and that one's the hybrid? Well, the cheeks are streaked, very finely streaked on mallards, and they're not streaked on. So it's a mess. Here's a couple more model duck hybrids. You can see that curled tail up there, the whiter tail down here. And then here's actual good model duck, the one that's thought to be pure. So it's a little bit tough trying to sort out what, you know, the individuals are. It's complicated by this hybrid process, but, you know, back before 2004, we didn't get any of this stuff. It's something that's changed. Another bird that seems to be coming up, invading us from the south, is the white-winged dove. This is in the same genus as a mourning dove. The tail's not quite as long. It's got this kind of white on the wing that's a big noticeable patch in flight. The squared off tail has white on the tip of the tail. And these birds, here's again the range map. They're not they're basically birds of Mexico and the Caribbean, and they kind of go up into the southwestern US, and they're thinly distributed along the Gulf Coast, and then in very South Florida, they can get to be pretty common. But we're up here, way outside the range. Okay. First record ever, 1998. Now we've got 50 records in that last, roughly 25-year period, 2 a year on average. Okay. Haven't quite got definitive nesting or definitive evidence of nesting, but I'm sure it's happened. We had everything except for the eggshells, I guess. and we've taken this species off the review list. And here again is a chart of the occurrence of these birds. The very first one in 1998, and then every year for the next 5 years. No, we missed a year. And then over the next 10-year period, maybe every other year or so. And then now 8 records in 2016, 6 records in 2017, 6 records in 2018. And then we took them off the list. And again, if we use the eBird chart, this is for the last 3 years. Okay. A whole bunch of sightings up here in our population center in Northeast Illinois. Right, here's another record, here's another record, here's another record, here's another one over here, a couple in very far south Illinois, and then in the St. Louis area, whether that's on the Missouri side or the Illinois side, but there, it's completely changed. I mean, it's yet another species, never occurred in the state until 1998, and now we get multiple individuals coming every year. I heard somebody talking about limpkins. All right, so this is the first state record of limpkin in the state of Illinois, and this was 4 years ago. This one was down in Richland County, kind of in the southeastern portion of Illinois. And we heard it, and it was like, limpkin? No one thought there was going to be a limpkin. From time to time, people, compile these, their best guesses is that in the next 10 species that are going to show up in Illinois, nobody would have thought limpkin. Not at all. But yet, there it happened. Okay. Then what happens? Well, here's the sequence, right? So in 2019 was the very first individual. Nothing in 2020, but then 2 more records in 2021, 2 more records in 2022. Okay, when I first put the slides together for this presentation, there were 19 records in 2023. But then before I gave the thing, I gave this presentation a week ago. And at that point, midweek, it went up to 20 before then, and then 21 just before the presentation. And then between last week and this week, another 4 records have shown up. Okay, so 25 different records of these things, and some of those are more than one bird associated with each of those records. I think there's like three, maybe 4 of them have had 2 birds at least. So something like we're getting close to 30 limpkins in the state right now, where one hasn't occurred previously. Here's Sibley and the Sibley Field Guide. Here's the range map for limpkin in Sibley's guide. He doesn't bother to show you anything other than Florida. Well, I guess that's not quite true. Here's Alabama and here's Georgia. And with those others, the purple is like the permanent residence range. This is year-round in peninsular Florida. And then the green is Sibley's color for rare, where they occur rare. But even in Georgia, the people were shocked when these limpkins started showing up, because it was very unusual to have a limpkin in Georgia, let alone Illinois. Okay, and this is the depiction of the range map in the year 2014, 10 years ago. Here's the eBird map. Okay, this is just this year. All right, a little bit bigger range. Here's Illinois. Illinois basically runs like in here. right? So we're going, here's all the Great Lakes. There's Lake Erie, here's New York State, Pennsylvania. Here's a record near Philadelphia, a record near Washington, D.C. And look at this. I mean, they've just gone wild. What the heck is going on, right? And so basically 10 years ago, they were just in Florida. And also they're a bird of tropical Americas. So they're in Central America, South America, whatnot, but not North America, or actually I shouldn't say that, given that Panama is part of North America, but not in the 48 lower US states at all. But look at this. I mean, they're just all over the place, just all over the place. This is a huge change. Very unusual to have that happen. This is a somewhat older story, the black-necked stilt. Okay, so black-necked stilt, range map, bird of, they get out into the western portion of the United States, then migrate south into Mexico, portions of Central America, what have you. This is the Birds of the World depiction, 1999. Here's the National Geographic Society's range map. Looks kind of the same, except it's covering a bit more area here. And you start to see this movement kind of coming up the Mississippi River Valley in here, right? So that's something that between year 2000 and the year 2011, its distribution was changing enough that you were starting to see changes in how people depicted the range maps. In Illinois, Dave Boland's book back in 1989 described the black-necked stilt as a very rare vagrant or migrant. Now, birds had shown up in Illinois for as long as there were, people from, this kind of like the Western European colonization of the United States. When the naturalists over there came and looked at things, there were occurrences of black-necked stilt up here, but very, very rarely. We removed the species from the review list 25 plus years ago, in part because they started breeding in the state. These were the first known nestings of the birds. They had occurred previously, but weren't known to nest. And then over the 1990s, at least 4 separate occurrences of breeding. And then now if we look, say this is a picture over the last 3 years that, again, back to this view where here's the border between Illinois and Wisconsin, Mississippi River coming down, the Ohio River, and up, the border between Illinois and Indiana. And you can see that black-necked stilts are now, they're no longer a very rare vagrant or migrant. They just come up and, we get to April, they start showing up all sorts of different places. In the maybe 20 years ago, it was much more common for them to be in the South, not so common in the central or the northern part. As I mentioned, that like the North American Birds Journal, I co-write the seasonal reports with Keith McMullen and Jim Hengeveld for that, and we were kind of tracking this change in the black-necked stilts. That the birds that were showing up in the central tier of Illinois or in the northern tier of Illinois were notable because that didn't happen very much. Now it's ho-hum. Now we don't go out, these are, again, I'll make the point that these are rare birds. We don't go out every day and see a black-necked stilt, but it's so much more feasible to do that now. Another one of these problem birds, the anhinga. I say problem birds because sometimes we get into these identification issues. So the anhinga is, an aquatic bird. It's kind of like a cormorant, a little snakier looking, more tied to southern cypress swamps and things like that. There's a little bit of difference of opinion when you go back into the literature back in the middle of the 19th century. Some authors thought that they were common in the state. Others thought that they were present, but not so common. In Boland's compendium back in 1989, he basically noted only 3 records in that he had evidence for. They were in 1942, 1968, 1977. Okay, so they had occurred in the state. We had records that we could adjudicate. We have evidence of nesting down in the Cache River from 2009. They're probably breeding a lot of other places as well. And they're getting to be more common. And recently, last year, the Records Committee took them off the review list for the southern third of the state. They're still unusual in the central portion or the northern portion, and so we're trying to track that more closely and still request documentation. But down in the south, you know, no longer considered to be particularly unusual. Another one of these charts with, you know, and I marked documented Anhinga records, again, with the dark blue for the ones that we accepted, the pale blue for the ones that we didn't. Some of those ones that we didn't are probably valid Anhinga sightings. It's just that, you know, maybe some issues with how they were described, or maybe issues with whether the Records Committee members got a good night's sleep the night before. But you know, some of it is, you know, there's kind of an art to describing birds and whatnot. But so I put them in there too, because some of those might be valid records. But in any case, so these are the records that we've adjudicated, and you can see again that pattern from, this is back in 1985, kind of going forward. 1985 being the year of formation of the Records Committee, and so the records since then very thin for the first 20 years, and then we start to see this annual pattern of with multiple records per year. So it's changed again. Here's the range map depiction, the National Geographic Society's depiction, that field guide from 2010. Again, you know, coming up the Mississippi River Valley, getting into Illinois that way. And then this is you know, an eBird set of sightings from the last couple of years, showing that, you know, this is not as dramatic as some of these other things. The range looks kind of the same, but, you know, there's not a lot of detail to show sort of numbers of individuals. And so there's this general shift northward of this species, something that used to be rare, again, being common. This is at the Cache River, in eBird, if you go look at the high count, 10 individuals on this one checklist down in the Cache River Basin in southern Illinois. So that's 10 at one site at one time, right? For a bird that we used to, you know, there were only 3 records in the first 3/4 of the 20th century. So changes. Here's another one. Puzzle for you folks. Where's the neotropic cormorant in this photograph? This is down at Rainbow Park in Chicago on the Lake Michigan lakefront. And there's a whole bunch of double-crested cormorants, and then there's one neotropic cormorant. And if you want to see if you can figure out where it is, it's the one that's smallest, right? And a good tip for trying to look for neotropic cormorants, they're often hanging out with the double-crested cormorants or regular cormorant. And the neotropic cormorants seem to have a habit of liking the higher perches. You know, they get up higher than the double-crested cormorants. And so this is the neotropic bird. And if you stare at it long enough and squint your eyes, you can convince yourself, yeah, it's smaller than the other birds. But that's tough. It's a tough call sometimes. But again, you know, bird of the American tropics, basically. You know, so here's I think the Tropic of Cancer comes in through here, and the Tropic of Capricorn through there. It's mostly the tropics and the near tropics that where they reside. We're up in Illinois, not part of the range. But they've been moving north. There's always been small populations down in the Southwest, like Southeast Arizona. Those populations have grown, and they're starting to disperse all over the place. Bolin, in his book, cites 2 records, one of which this was the first accepted record at Lake Renwick down in Will County in 1986. That was the first record. There's a specimen. I think this is in the Smithsonian. So, you know, I don't know. So at some point we'll try to make a project to see that that's still there, and maybe we can add that in. Yeah, okay, yeah, go ahead. I don't know, can we hear you if you speak? Can we hear our Zoom participants? Yeah, okay. Well, sorry about that. We're not going to be able to hear you if you speak. Yeah, if you have a question, write it into the chat and we'll get to it. So anyways, so we'll call this the first one, right? So basically Bolin scoured all the literature and he found two credible mentions of neotropic cormorant having occurred in Illinois by 1989. Now we have 56 different records. 10 more of those came in the last 15 years, or 9 more of them came in the last 15 years of the 20th century, and then 44 in our current century. And it was with a sigh of relief that we took them off the review list, because as you could see from that first slide, you know, they're hard to tell apart from the double-crested cormorants. Again, our little chart, you know, kind of here and there, every couple of years, kind of a typical pattern for a rare bird. And then they start occurring every year and in multiple numbers. And the scale, this is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, and then 2 more, 1 more, 3 more. This year in 2017, there were 11 records. So the situation has completely changed. And again, with the high count, a high count of 10 neotropic cormorants. They're hanging out in summertime and probably breeding down in southern Illinois now. This is at Horseshoe Lake State Park, kind of over in the St. Louis area. Here's a photograph of 3 swimming together. This is an adult bird and then 2 juveniles over there. That's Frank Holmes sightings, both on this photograph is his, and then the that checklist with 10 noted. And then another one of these birds, the roseate spoonbill. And this is another thing that's kind of this year, things are going crazy. So this is a bird of, you know, the same general area, you know, just along the Gulf Coast, you know, here in the United States, and then throughout the tropics. Okay. And there's some evidence, you know, not at the point of accepted records from some, you know, from 2,000 years ago, 100 years ago, 130, 50 years ago. But the first bona fide record happened this century in 2003. And now we have 11 accepted records, including 5 this year that we haven't, they're good records. They're, you know, frame-filling photographs of these things. And again, the same situation like with Olympians. When I first started to pull together the slides, there are only 3 this year. And then between when I started pulling this presentation together till tonight, we now had 2 more. And so there are 5 this year. So here again is that same kind of pattern where here's the very first one, and then they start showing up more after that, and then they become annual. And so they're still on our review list, but I wouldn't be surprised if this pattern continues in about another 5, 6, 7 years. We'll probably take them off the review list. Black vulture, another bird of the South. This is a bird, again, I live right next to Montrose Point in Chicago. And so I do a lot of birding there. This is this one bird that was hanging out in Lincoln Park for a while. Eventually it got taken in to a wildlife rehabilitator. It didn't have anything wrong with it, except it was emaciated. So they brought it back to health and then released it down in southern Illinois. Here's the range of birds according to the National Geographic Society Field Guide, the edition published in 2010, 2011. They've been moving up the East Coast. You know, I mentioned I was living in New Jersey and New York before, and I was watching the expansion across New Jersey when I was down in there. They started out being on the review list, unless in the Shawnee National Forest, and then that was adjusted to be all of the southern tier, where they were considered regular down there. And now we've removed them completely from the review list because we get we get black vultures showing up in the northern part of Illinois on a regular basis. Here's our familiar chart of the number of records per year, and you can kind of see the pattern. And I don't even think we're capturing all these birds here. Swallow-tailed kite, another bird, another invader from the south. A little bit different story with this guy historically. Here's the range map. There, it's not just the Gulf Coast, so it's down in that Florida and a kind of across, going all the way over to Louisiana. But the prior to, back in the 19th century, they extended all the way up to Minnesota. And then, with the westward expansion of human populations, or at least so-called Western civilization, they kind of got eliminated and they retreated down to their current range. So, back in the day, they were common in Illinois, and you can kind of read in like Ridgway's book and Kennicott's book about that. But by the time that Bolin came around, taking stock of things, he described it as a very rare vagrant. Okay. And then now, 30 years after that, we remove it from the review list because they're occurring quite regularly. 25 records just in this century. And with, after we took them off the review list, of course, that didn't stop them from coming. They kept coming. There's our chart. So here's the list of these species that I've mentioned, okay, with all these invaders from the south. This is the year that they first occurred, and then here's the year that we declared that they were a regular part of the bird life of Illinois. And so there's, a lot of changes, and basically changes that are happening, these year of first record are, roughly speaking, about the year 2000, and then coming off the review list at about the year 2020, 20-year time span between first occurrence and when they're deemed, at least in this certain sense, common. Big changes. Yes.
Can you contribute that to the bird sightings and the people entering the data? There's a lot more people now entering data in the bird versus back in the 80s when there wasn't as many people.
Yeah, that's a good question. So there, there are a lot of possible explanations for what's going on, right? What's the idea here? Is it an increase in observer effort? Is it an increase in the number of observers, right? Not only that, we've got a lot better communication within the birding community. Word travels fast over, group meet chats and Discord and groups and, what have, we have all this communication and a lot of information sharing. And people that are, maybe not diehard hobbyists or whatever, but notice things, they're also connected to the community. And so, there was a couple that spotted a brown booby in Tazewell County. And they said, what's this? They took a photo, and eventually the photo came into the birds left, but the photograph was there. And so brown booby is not, so there's a lot of interconnectedness, right? Or is it a range expansion from environmental conditions? And so it's a good question, and I'm not an expert on all this stuff, but in my opinion, that for these invaders from the south, things have changed so that these birds they didn't used to come north, and now they're coming north, and they're coming more north in numbers enough so that it's no longer a really strange and unusual occurrence. Okay, I'll give a different answer when I finish with the stragglers on from the west. Okay, so I'm going to kind of cruise through these kinds of things because I spent too much time talking about those southerners coming up. But here basically we've got, the eastern half of the country and the kind of the forested area east of the Mississippi. We've got the Great Plains and then the mountainous west. It's very different over here, very different kind of bird life. And occasionally some of these things show up over here. All right. What are they? Well, there's the Swainson's hawk. Okay, the Swainson's hawk is in the summertime. It's in the American and Canadian West. And here's the range map, right? So they're all up here in the summertime, and then they all fly down through Mexico and they go down to Argentina to spend the winters. Okay. There's always been, well, maybe not always, but at least as long as I've been aware of the bird life of Illinois, there's been a little remnant population in McHenry and Kane County. And other than that, they were on the review list, and it's probably going to be the case that they're still in I forget which they're still in Kane, but not McHenry. And whereas previously there used to be like 5 pairs, I think there's only 1 now regularly. So that group might be snuffed out. But outside of that population, the records committee looked at things, and these were the records that we evaluated. And then people set up these hawk watches at Illinois Beach and at Fort Sheridan and DuPage County. And the Illinois Beach Hawk Watch, this is the number of sightings that they get over the years that they've been operating. And so in this case, what happened was that a bird that we thought of as being rare is no longer rare. Well, here's it. And now if you look at eBird sightings over the last 10-year period or so, you can see that there are many more of these things being observed. The Townsend solitaire, kind of thrush from the mountainous west. If you want to look for these, and they're sometimes here in the winter, find juniper trees and juniper shrubs. They eat the juniper berries in winter. Again, a bird of the American West. We removed it from the review list last year, 43 accepted records. This one, there's a mix. If you look at neighboring states, some of them have it on the review list, some don't. But this is the number of sightings that we have that have been accepted by the records committee. And you can see it, they went from very thin and to kind of every other year to now they're happening every year. With a couple of years ago, we had eight records. Okay. Western tanager, same sort of thing, bird of the American West. Here's the number of observations over this period of time. And another bird that is a bird of the American West that might, sometimes shows up out of range to the east, but for whatever reason, they're not showing up more regularly. They were actually not they were on and off the review list in this period, but in the last 20 years, not too many records of them. So here's which states think of these things as rare, kind of the stack of states just to our west. Minnesota sitting on top of Iowa, sitting top of Missouri. We've got Wisconsin directly above us, Michigan to the east of Wisconsin, and Indiana below Michigan and to our east. So you can see that west of us, Swainson's hawk isn't considered rare, but a little bit of, what do you want to call it, split personality a little bit over to our east. Townsend solitaire occurs quite regularly across that whole region. And again, this kind of the Western tanager, not on the review list west of us for the most part, but yes, on the review list, mostly to our east. And for whatever reason, varied thrush is not in any of these lists, and we're not getting them. But when we look at these again and ask the same question, why are we seeing more of these? In this case, I think it's basically that well, I don't know, if you can think of it as like change in observer effort or spatial distribution or whatever. But I think of it as just we find out that these birds are there much more easily now, and that it may not be a change in the pattern. It's just that we're able to see what's actually going on much better. And then super quick, over the top of the world. There's not so much a thematic structure here, but there's some interesting things that happen. Here's Illinois right here, okay? And we're getting birds that are normally over here, all right, or much to our north, and then some birds that are normally over here, showing up in our area on a more regular basis. The barnacle goose, this is one where there are lots and lots of historic records, but because you've got these aviculturalists that keep a lot of waterfowl. The question is always, is it a wild bird or is it a somebody's pet? Here's some of the, and because of that, there's been kind of, well, anyways, let me not go into the details. We can talk about it after because I'm running out of time. I've run out of time, but this is the normal range. This is over in Europe. Here's Scandinavia with Norway, Sweden, Finland. Here are the British Isles. This is Greenland. This is Iceland over here. This is Svalbard, these islands up in the north that are part of Norway. And then this is Western Siberia. And so there's a big population. There's a population of barnacle geese in Greenland that normally winters in the British Isles. The Svalbard birds go down to Scotland, and these Siberian birds, they end up over in here in the winter. And then about 20 years ago, there was a big increase in the Greenland population that quadrupled. These resident populations started getting established. Birds started breeding in here, and there was this change in distribution. And you can see that if birds are flying normally all the time from here to here, it's not that big a jump over into into North America. And there was one, this is Svalbard in here, a bird that was banded on the nest in there was recovered. It was a band recovery over in Canada. So we know they do this naturally. And so we've kind of changed our thinking about that. If you're into gulls, there's the slaty-back gull. This is an interesting story. This is a bird that is over in Japan and Eastern Siberia. Here's the list of records. The first one in Illinois was 1983. This was down near St. Louis. It also happened to be the first slaty-back gull ever found in the lower 48 states, anywhere, right? And then 6 years later, up in the upper Mississippi River along the Illinois border was our second one. And then a period of 20 plus years before one was found in Carlisle. And then they start coming more frequently. What's going on here? This is their normal range. This is Japan. This is Korea. This is this kind of range along these islands. Here's Alaska. There's a little piece in Alaska. And if you look, here's that little jutting out piece of Alaska. Here's Japan and Korea. And basically these birds breed here and then migrate south this way. And sometimes birds, when they migrate, their directionality gets messed up and they fly the other way instead. That's how we get some of these South American flycatchers showing up here. They're migrants in South America, but they end up flying the wrong way. And so if you imagine, instead of flying this way, you fly this way, you end up down in Texas on that same sort of migration route. But we've been losing a lot of the summer ice in the Arctic Ocean. And so there's a lot more movement into that period in the summer months. And then the birds that are up here, they've got all sorts of different directions to go. And so with the slaty-back gull, this is one of these eBird maps. These are all the sightings in eBird from 70 to 79, and kind of following up on your comment earlier, not too many people were have put their 1970s sightings into eBird. So, but nonetheless, they were confined to the normal range, right, up in Alaska. The next decade, here are those two Illinois birds that I mentioned, and also some sightings up in the Pacific Northwest. The 90s, even more sightings over here. In the aughts, a lot more sightings across the US. Then in the 2010s, they've made it over to Europe. Okay. And then so far, we've got 4 years out of the 10 here, half that, and it looks like, it's kind of the same volume. And so this pattern is continuing. And again, if you get out into here, here's, the